Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas, and I'm going to be your host. And today we're going to be talking about crafting meaningful narratives through gameplay. Now, balancing narrative and gameplay is a challenge that has puzzled game designers for decades. But thankfully, there are lots of effective ways to overcome these obstacles. So, today we're going to take a deep dive into how ludonarrative experimentation can redefine this balance. With insights drawn from our guests' extensive expertise in narrative driven games, we discuss how novel design strategies and mechanics can lead to more immersive and thought provoking player experiences. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey, everybody, and we're back. And today with us, I have Sergey, Nowak. How's it going, my friend? And thanks for being here on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's going well. Very busy. I just came back from the Tokyo Game Show and really happy to be here.
Well, I am as well because, as we were just discussing pre-recording, know you're a busy guy. It's late for you, so it means a lot for me, but us to have you here today. Now, who is Ata? Well, first and foremost, he's the managing director and co-founder at Torpor Games. And man, you have quite an extensive background, specifically with like everything from narrative and strategy game development, which is part of the reason why we're talking here today, but also like experience in business strategy, startup mentorship, consulting for game studios, and leading, in business development efforts for emerging companies. And these are all very important skills. And clearly you've been doing this a while if you really dialed in on those things. And I mean, hey, as being a studio, you also have some involvement with certain projects like Squad, Terminal Conflict, Black Ice mod, Project Reality mod. I mean, if you don't mind, like share some insight about those, because you have some other projects too, like if I'm saying this, Suzerain, and you have some DLC content around the Kingdom of Rizia. I mean, share us a little bit more about Torpor Games and maybe some of these games, especially the more recent ones or the ones that you have in development.
Yeah, sounds good. I mean, there's a lot of things there, and some of them are pretty much like some of the older ones. So our most active and current project is Suzerain from Torpor Games. That's been released December 2020 in its initial launch. We recently released a major DLC, like a new type of game, kind of a situation in March this year in 2024. And we're also developing our prequel for Suzerain, which is called The Conformist as well at the same time. The other things you mentioned are from my previous experiences and previous projects, and those two mods as well. Actually, those two mods are essentially why I got into the games industry. They taught me how to, tinker around existing games, change certain things, and work with an international group of people. Yeah, and I'm a big believer of being both a student and teacher. I really think that when you talk about something that you've experienced in, that you really solidify your thoughts and theories and everything. And then the more you learn, you adapt, and then it's just like a cycle. So that's why I've been doing these mentorships under Nowak Advisors, where I go to different events and I do one-on-one mentorship. I'm also part of the Growth Mentor Network, for example, where I do mentorship. My goal is to as we as a company are growing and developing more games, to spread this information to other people, indie studios, and then also self reflect throughout the process, to be again a student and then be a teacher.
Yeah, and you know what? First off, I absolutely love that. I mean, as they say, all ships rise with the tides. So it's serving as that force to help elevate and support others. And I mean, in addition to that too, I mean, it's not just through the work that you do, but you in other capacities like organizations, because I know that you've been, the co-captain of the game circle at Factory Berlin, which fosters like a lot of connections and discussions, with indie game studios and that community too. So it's always great to hear that, you're one of many that are out there contributing to the community and really helping us all to kind of whether it's get an edge or just a better understanding of things, because we all need so much of that. So thank you for sharing that about your company and all your other efforts too. Now, I'm just curious because, hey, like we already said, you are a busy guy. So when you're not so busy, or let's say when you're making time for other things that you enjoy to unplug, what might some of those things be?
There's a lot of things. I mean, I really enjoy reading about history and figuring out like certain like kind of more untold stories from history. So I love reading books or watching different types of entertainment about historical periods. Big fan of traveling. Whenever I travel, I do like very specific historical traveling. So I go to like a certain like slice of history and I try to like explore that part in that country, go into those cities or areas. So I'm a big fan of that. I'm also like a very curious person. So for me, like connecting to different people and like gathering different thoughts and opinions is something that really drives me. It gives me a lot of energy. So that's something I do a lot. So in my free time, beyond just also playing some games, I intellectually converse with a lot of people. I'm trying to understand where people are coming from. A lot of debate about politics, which our games at Torpor Games are a bit about. But also on the entertainment side, I play games like grand strategy games and narrative role-playing games. Like some grand strategies could be, like Crusader Kings. I also do play strategy games like RTS, like Gates of Hell, Call to Arms branch off game. And I used to play a lot more tactical shooters. I still play squad here and there because Project Reality, the mod, I contributed and was also a community member back in the day, turned into that game. Like it was those mod developers that then created Off-World Studios and the Kickstarter happened and they became a studio. So I still have like some of my heart is still with that team and game because I love teamwork based gameplay.
Nice, nice. And you know what? I love what you shared too about the history element. And I'm just curious naturally is have do you, I'm assuming part of that, do you like historical fiction to some extent?
Yeah, definitely. Like historical fiction is super interesting to me because of like, how different could things have gone and like
Yes.
what else could have happened. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, I found out I almost like discovered this recently. That's a huge like I had to connect some dots first, but like I was watching shows like Boardwalk Empire. Then my wife picked up a book for me that was based in the same period of time about a series of murders going on, but because the murders never got any attention, is because of everything going on with like the mobs and things like that. And then another one is The Terror, which
Mm.
talks about the Erebus and terror from these, UK based, naval ships trying to discover a way through the north. And anyways, that was really cool. And then I keep finding all these things and fascinates me. Sorry, I digress, folks, but love that stuff. And it's always fun to find other people, as I'm sure you can relate that enjoy the things you do. But speaking of enjoying things, or at least learning more about people, we got to move on. And that means we have to get you ready, or I'm sorry, it's too late. You should be ready if you're not, for the Q box round. And so, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's just a quick series of a few random questions I prepared here today for Ata. So, are you ready, man, for the Q box round?
Yeah, ready.
Awesome. All right. First is what advice would you give to someone else that's just starting out?
I think like one of the most important things is to go out there and research and talk to people and gather as many different information points as you can. One of the top challenges is getting to the right piece of information. It is easier nowadays than, 6 or 10 years ago. There is more industry information, there's more sharing as a culture now, but I would still say to make an informed rational decision, it's good to get as many reference points as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Do that research, folks. All right. Next is what is, your most influential or inspiring game?
Oh, there's a few, and this is always like a list that I shuffle around. I mean, I would say one of the games that really like left a huge impact was Shogun Total War for me. Like
I
the
love
one of
that one too.
the first one, like it just blew my mind. Like this combination of like map plus 3D battle space as an innovation, I think was like beyond. And it also opened my mind about strategy games. Also, like other games such as like for example, The Witcher 3 blew my mind. Like I never believed that I've ended the game and I felt like I lost friends at the end because I just like, couldn't interact with these characters anymore. I had like, I think a week long depression or withdrawal or something because it was just tough. And that shows you how much impact games can have. And yeah, there's a lot more, but I would say, anything that had that emotional impact, but also like, got me excited about the playful nature of games. Those are the things that really meant a lot to me. And I would also include Project Reality on that list of like a game that like a mod of a game that quite influenced me, because it was a Battlefield 2 mod, but it grew up to, have up to a million downloads and more, I think, because of how it united people like behind objectives, and it taught you how to teamwork, how to communicate. It was not about just, getting some good frag count or something. It was more about how do we collaborate? How do we cover each other? How do we reach an objective together? And I think those types of things really have huge impact on me. And yeah, I remember those.
Oh, wow, so good. And yeah, right on about the impact. And we're gonna get into some of what you just shared there on games and experiences that have meaning in a moment. And I'm also gonna just call out too, when you listed Witcher 3, it just brought back flashbacks of me having regrets for purchasing Bloodborne over that Witcher 3 when it was on sale, because I guess I'm just not a From Software person is really what it comes down to. But at any rate, moving on. Last but not least, and the staple here on the show here is, what game are you playing now?
So right now I'm actually playing the Crusader Kings 3. The latest DLC came out where you can, beyond being a landed lord, now you can actually be a wanderer and adventurer. So the entire game of managing a feudal area has changed. So now you can just like go from any place on the map, travel around, meet people. It has just added such a big dimension to that game. It's a really nice role-playing game. It's very systems driven, but you can kind of create your own stories with it. So that's what I've been playing a lot. I was also playing a lot more Gates of Hell, because it's just, I love my World War II RTS. I used to be a big Company of Heroes fan back in the day. So it's just scratching that itch of Company of Heroes 1 for me. So yeah, still going back to that one. Yeah, those are like the two things that I'm playing recently.
Sweet. Well, again, appreciate you for sharing that. There's interest and diving in a little bit more on some of these things really makes a difference. Get to know a little bit more about you. But now we're going to get to learn a lot more about something else, folks. And again, as I shared in the intro, we're going to be talking about crafting meaningful narratives, specifically through gameplay, because look, this is all super important stuff. I mean, making games is obviously important, but how we make games is even more important. So to kick things off, I'm just curious, can you just give us like a brief overview, because I know this is one area you really focus on, and is really important to everything from the design and execution and narrative. But can you give us like a brief overview of what ludonarrative design means to you and how it influences your approach to game development?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, and I think this is like an ongoing debate, and a big thing a lot of people would probably be able to comment on, and from different perspectives. But what it comes down to for me, like the ludonarrative aspect, is when game systems and storytelling combine in different ways. And this is like a large spectrum, in my opinion, where it can be multiple weights. So, for example, systems could be more dominant. Story could be just a small chunk in it that combines in the right way that creates a story, or it also could be a very strong story game that with a few certain levers suddenly changes and branches off, and people can playfully interact with the story now. I think there is some magic happening when it's done the right way, but there's also some very negative outcomes when these two things combine in a bad way, which means that you're enjoying a story and a mechanic is actually breaking the story for you, or vice versa. You're having a good time in a mechanic or a system or something playful, but then now you have to do something in the story that that is just maybe breaking what you're doing. So I think there is a lot of innovation space between these two elements, and this is something we're like trying to explore more with Torpor games, is to bring these different genres and these different ways of depicting games together in a cohesive manner.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's a really good point, because it's like, it can go both ways. Like in theory, and the concept of this is, sounds awesome to really essentially what we're all going for is creating that immersive experience. But again, there could be positives, there could be negatives. And what you just concluded there, I would love to dive in a little bit deeper there, about what that process might look like, especially as you're saying, like, through like experimentation and stuff. So, are there any, like, I don't know, specific examples of maybe things that relate to ludonarrative, like experiments that you guys have actually done and tried in your games, or even just other experiences, and kind of what were the results of those were.
Yeah, I mean, I think to give full context, I'll tell a bit about the games we're making. So, Suzerain is a political role-playing game with strategy elements. So it has narrative components, which have a larger narrative framework. You play a president ruling a fictional country in the 1950s, and the game is fully designed as a head-on political experience. As in, you can express yourself in different opinions. You can change the country. The people around you are a huge factor. So it's not like a God mode game where you just tell and it happens. Like, we're trying to dive into the reality of politics, basically. So it is an expressionist game. And by expressionist, I mean people go in it and they want to change the world with their own vision or with the vision of the RP that they're doing in their mind. And they're clashing with characters. The story is changing. It's a very branching story. So by the end of the game, the country could be in many different states. The people could be in many different situations. So if it was just a narrative role-playing game, that would be the only thing. But Suzerain incorporates multiple smaller experimentations. So for example, we have an economy system inside the game. So all the actions you do contribute in a different way to the economy. Now, whenever this works, it can be brilliant. So this means, for example, when you meet your economy minister and you're debating what national strategy to develop, what construction project to do, what driver of the economy you want to push, these then changes the levers of the economy, which have different impacts on the growth of the economy, which has ripple effects on your budget, on how people talk to you and everything. So when it works, you have a resource-based system that complements the narrative. So the stuff you do in the story suddenly change the country in the systems and the depiction of the systems, and this can work very well. But if it doesn't work well, is when the story says I'm doing great, but then the system breaks down. It's like, oh no, like your country's actually not that great. These are the moments when that disconnect between the narrative and the story and the branching and the systems. This disconnect. Whenever this happens, the experience falls apart and people just get taken out of that immersion. So we spend a lot of time fine-tuning and custom building solutions and polishing these edges, these potential desyncs for like a long time in development to avoid those types of issues. And they still happen, but they have like gotten like way less over time as we've kind of figured out how best to do this.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, when you're talking about like how how to best to do that, like is there a particular approach, or is I mean, how do you approach like testing these things, whether it's new mechanics or narrative ideas? Because again, like as you called out to earlier, it could go either way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very case by case basis, and it depends on the situation. So another example that's a bit bigger and maybe a bit more like wild is in our new DLC, The Kingdom of Rizia. We, instead of being a republic, we're now depicting a monarchy where you are the king. You have more direct power over the country. So the systems are a bit more like stronger in the game design. But also in the Rizia DLC, we have a war mechanic, which means when you declare war, you get an entire turn-based, multi-unit, map-based, like turn-based strategy game. So within a story game now is an entirely different game. And the thing here is you cannot really detach it fully from the story. It's impossible. But you cannot lock the story fully to this mechanic either. Because what if the player does not want to go to war? So now, technically, you can play the DLC without going to war ever. And you will never see the mechanic that we've developed. We've spent months and months and months on it, and we're not enforcing people to play it. And the other thing is, how did we make that mechanic work well? And how did that process go? Is we've built it in tandem and in parallel. And we kept getting feedback from our like users and testers, early testing. We kept iterating on the connections between the story and the mechanic. These were like resources. For example, you need to build your armor divisions. Those armor divisions are built outside of the war mechanic. You're building your factories that are deploying the tanks, and then you're deploying the tanks in the mechanic. But if the tanks are not being deployed in the mechanic, they still serve as power projection to scare other nations off diplomatically, for example. So we've built things that work in different types of ways, and it goes both ways. And it's an iterative process, and you just got to keep going along the steps. Things change a lot, and you just have to adapt and see where they desync, and that's what you target and make sure you polish enough.
Yeah, one of the things I absolutely love that you called out too is like I know part of this is probably relating to the feedback and other, triggers and indicators that you see, but essentially what you called out to is like taking very much an empathetic approach and not like creating like let's say new content or systems or DLC whatever it may be that could potentially ostracize or neglect part of your player base. And it's just because it's a lot of times it's like, hey, this is going to be implemented, we're going to add it, and sometimes we may be faced with the problem where like it's either this or the highway, and we might do some quick percentages. It's like, okay, this will only affect 10% people, but the majority that we care about is that 90, fine. And well, yes, let's face it, sometimes those decisions have to be made, but in this case it's like, there's still money on the table regardless of what that percentage is, so to speak. And it's just interesting because I think sometimes even taking an empathetic approach can be a challenging one. But what you guys called out, and part of your process, at least with that project, is at least being very mindful of, and then intent, having
Yep.
proper intent with it.
100%. I mean, this is, from like suzerain, we knew a lot of players did want something related to war, but we're like, this does not fit this experience, and it was tacked on to the latter part of it for a certain branch. But there is no mechanic. It's just purely dialogue based choices that change the outcome. We said, okay, if there is demand, but it needs to fit to what we're building, and because we are building political experiences that have deep meaning, make you think, all these things, this mechanic of war needs to like kind of like be a perfect place in this puzzle that we're now delivering a new puzzle. And as you've said, a lot of our audience, they didn't want to play the war, and we gave them the option not to do it, and we gave them other benefits of interacting with elements related to that mechanic. The same thing with those who did go to war. We also gave them the option to give the war to the generals, which then calculates based on the resources you've built how well you're doing throughout that process. And although the story decisions you've made, some of them still impacted without you playing it. So we always thought about like what would different types of players want to have an experience like, and then we kind of adapted ourselves to that. We collected feedback along the way. We made sure, we're leaving a lot of doors open for in the experience. We don't force people because our experiences are very customizable in a way. They're very, role playing, expression, finding your own path in what we're designing. So locking people down is definitely not something we like to do unless it's absolutely core to the message we want to deliver.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, it just makes so much sense. But again, it can be a challenge. And I mean, in that challenge, I mean, I'm sure there's cases where, there's potential pitfalls, especially with people that are looking to trying to execute this type of, strategy or approach to making games this way. So I'm also curious too, as we identified, what are some, pitfalls that designers, should watch out for when they're attempting to integrate, complex narratives into, these gameplay mechanics? Because I'm sure it's one of those things, we get into that groove, we see that there's something there, and next thing you know, oh, we could get blindsided, or we do.
Yeah, I think it definitely thematically needs to come together. So even if the systems are not there, like the system is derived out of the narrative and the experience you want to deliver. So there needs to be a natural like fitting together. I think that's like one key element to ensure from the start. And the second part is definitely testing this stuff early, getting like actual like data from the community, playing it yourself. Like you notice as soon as the core experience of a game suffers because of the changes you've made, and you notice this organically, you need to play it or you need others to tell you by playing it. You notice then that like the deviation you made is either not like doesn't fit well or wasn't like done to a certain quality enough to have that. So it's very important to run through those like steps early as possible in the process. And I say like with role playing experiences and story experiences, anything that derives out of it really needs to fit well with the loop between story systems. It's like an input output loop, and that loop needs to be honed and polished to perfection. Iteration is the key, I think, in this process. The lower our iteration cycles were on these things, the more friction we noticed. The higher it was, the more uniqueness of this experimentation came forward.
Excellent. Yeah. So again, it really just comes down to process, folks. When you're looking to avoid some of these pitfalls, and between, what is that essential core experience like, and also aligning that with feedback you may be receiving, it's all going to then start to, slowly reveal itself. But again, if we just put on the shutters and just go get into a tunnel vision, we might not be able to see that. So it's funny because sometimes these pitfalls are more simple to avoid than we may realize, but we got to approach it as such. You know, it, a lot of what we're talking about here with, designing games this way, ludonarrative and such, there's a big reason why we're doing this, and it's really coming down to essentially like being not just empathetic of players, but understanding and being mindful of the player agency and emotional impact. Like ultimately, that's really the goal what we're doing, and like you said, with some of the games that you played, I mean, having that meaningful and emotional or whatever type of impact there, and part of that immersion is so important. So I want to kind of focus a little bit now more on that side of things, because again, at the end of the day, folks, regardless of how we design our games, I would imagine outside of like, the commercial viability of creating games, we're also looking to create some type of meaningful impact. So that said, focusing on, agency and emotions and things like that, I'm just curious, like first, like how would you like define player agency as it relates to our context currently? And, what do you consider, its most critical elements in game design?
I think like me included, but I see this in other people as well. Like we're getting into games to have an experience that's designed for us, but have the freedom and the ability to navigate within them, which means that we want to turn the story to our story. But we want to do this in a way that of course fits the designer's, confines and the limitations of what we've been put up with. But we're subscribing to an experience. We're reading about it, we're buying it, we're going in. I want to have this experience, but I want to be able to feel like it's also my experience. So it's essentially a very empathetic process, as you've said. Like empathy is a key element of also why we as a company have created all the content we've created to drive forward more empathy in the world and make people think about other perspectives. So agency is absolutely important, especially in these narrative story experiences. We've developed a lot of branching for this, precisely because branching and expression of different dialogue options, different decisions, different strategic choices, all of these say, now this is a bit more my game, not just the designer's game. I'm still within that space, I'm still within that playground, but I made it a bit more mine now. And sometimes it's a pure on illusion as well, right? Sometimes like the choices we make in games are just there to trick us to feel like we are driving the car, but many times it's not. So I think it's absolutely key in certain types of experiences to give agency. Not in all. There are different types of games. There are different types of interactive mediums, of course, that are more linear as well. But for us, it's an absolute must. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that line you said, like getting to that point where, essentially players, and I would say even both parties, developer and player, coming to that point where, but especially the players saying, making it my game. Like, what is it about this experience that now is their experience, not just the developer's experience, right? And I think that's a key point that we always try to strive for, and difficult to nail. But when we when we get to that point, or maybe I should say not when we get to it, but in terms of how we're crafting that experience, sometimes it could be challenging, especially as it relates to agency, because sometimes if we give too much agency or too little, again, like walls can fall down. So, I mean, are there any examples that you can share where providing or even limiting player agency, has a significant impact, I guess, on their emotional responses, players' emotional responses?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, agency scaling up and down is a big challenge in developing games because, as you've said, like giving unlimited agency, it's kind of like, if you could do everything, technically you end up doing nothing because it's like, this decision paralysis that happens because it's just like you could do everything. Like, sure, what does that mean? There's a thing about like humanity, like there is in some ways, not this doesn't apply for everything, but in sometimes like limitations are a strength because it pushes us to be creative, to adapt, and to find solutions within limitations. And I see games like that as well. For example, in our game, we have an entire storyline about constitutional reform in Suzerain. And there we're changing the constitution of an entire nation. And this is pretty much a very deep, hardcore process. In reality, it's very difficult to do. But in this storyline, we have kind of created like a puzzle where multiple parties, their wishes, their characters' wants, you can bribe them, you can convince them, you can pass policies that make their MPs vote for the change that you're going to make, but maybe the leaders are not voting. Like creating a space where they have to figure out a sort of a puzzle that relates to the core theme of the game, or the core message that the game wants to deliver. And within this limitation, they are navigating that, and they're having an exciting time because they have a challenge. They have a storyline. It has like a climax. It has an ending. And like all these things we noticed can drive up a lot of emotion. And for example, we would have never believed that successfully passing their own constitution in suzerain would make people cry. And some people cried because they passed the constitution. And this does not make any sense, because a lot of people say, politics is boring, it's like you don't want to get into this, all this stuff. Like we're exactly showing that a lot of things done in certain ways, even like what people suppose is like probably the most driest thing, can be done in a way to make huge impact.
Yeah, and you know what? I absolutely love that example. I mean, at the time of the recording, at least here in the US, there's a, big election going on, presidential one here. And as you were saying that, it made me back where sure a lot of us we focus on these things that are happening now, but if we look back to the time, or at least in my context, in my case, when the US was founded, and for what reasons, and what was the sole purpose and intent, that so many people are risking their lives, their lifestyle style, livelihood, and all these things. I mean, that is pretty emotional when you think about it at that level. And to then convey that and communicate that, whether it may be, a linear experience or one that has lots of, choices to be made. I mean, that says so much. And it's again, it can be a challenge to do those things, but it says so much, and to get to that point, and it just puts it on a whole new level, right? When creating these types of experiences. So, I mean, in that though, you know, I'm curious too, because it's like, wow, this can get really in depth, and we could probably talk hours on these things. But like, what would you say are even like just even if they're high level, some techniques or strategies that you can use, to make player decisions feel more meaningful, within the context of these things? Because what you just described is great, but like, is there any other examples in how this can be done? Because it sounds like I'm hearing this, I can get it, I see it, but it sounds like it could be really challenging. So, what are maybe some great ways to approach this?
I think like there are a lot of ways to approach this, and I think it really depends on what type of a game you're building and what type of experience you're building. One of the elements that's super important, I think, is like really what is the experience you're trying to deliver. So like really defining, okay, I want a person to have a lot of logical challenges about a certain subject. This could be like, I don't know, a resource-based game. I want someone to have a great experience about, I don't know, having like a garden and gardening, and then that's a cozy game where you garden and stuff like that. It really does change a lot from game to game and what you're trying to achieve. It's important, a few things. One of the things is it's important to have the right team and skill set of people around you to deliver a certain experience. So like making sure that the people around you have some affinity or the potential to upskill to be able to deliver a game that you are passionate about or envisioning. I think that's a huge part of it. There are other parts as well. So one of the reasons why I think ludonarrative is a strong reason to chase for us, but also maybe for others, is because bringing in different genre elements together in the right way can draw a lot of new audience to your game. So it can actually allow your game to be genre reaching and like kind of mixing in a way. So basically you pull in crowds from different places in the marketplace. But if you don't do it in a good way, you actually piss off everyone you pull in. So that's the downside of that part. So I think it's really important to define what you're targeting, who you're building it with, and just honing those skills and that team chemistry over a long time with as many iterations as possible. And another thing I think that's really important, this is something that has helped us a lot, and it has also pushed our game to multiples of growth over the years, even though it's a single player game, even though it's about politics, which nobody would have ever expect to, reach a larger audience. It's making a game an evolving game. And this does not fit every concept, but I think it's okay. We're human. At the end of the day, we give our best. There are elements in our products and the work we do that are not perfect. There are maybe resources that are not aligned. If you keep working on a game, you can tackle a lot of the things that you couldn't tackle over time. And if you have a good community that supports you, that maybe shows a guiding light and is with you throughout the journey, in time you will get to a lot of the subjects if you still have like the velocity of resources and energy. So for us, switching to an evolving game strategy in two and then releasing our first free update in 23 was great because the game is just not much better and it's getting bigger and just way better. So yeah, that's been super helpful.
Wow, so many great things there. Like the ones I'll call out to specifically are, what is the experience you're trying to create? Because I mean, I feel like we always throw around the words, oh, immersive and create this experience. But what ultimately is it coming down to, which I think also relates to this other point you made, just ensure the people around you have some sort of affinity, and that could be relate to other things, other themes that relate to the game and everything else, because through that like focus you can be a little bit more inclusive too, but at the same time while it broadens things a little bit at a focus level, it's not broadening across the board, because like you said, if you try to do everything, you said this in various capacities throughout our conversation, if you do too much, you're going to get left with nothing or accomplishing nothing or making everybody mad because, there's so many ways about doing it. But no, really great things that you said there. And those are the two that I encapsulated on. And, just really great stuff. And I mean, in light of all this, I mean, unfortunately, we're coming on time here, but wow, it's like the gears in my head are turning. I know we could talk a lot more than what we have time for today. But in light of that, as we get ready to close, what are some tips, suggestions, things that you would like to, share with our listeners today that they could maybe use and take action with?
I think like the industry is like changing a lot and it's changing fast right now due to the economic and also like performance related changes in the marketplace, how communities are made and how they grow and retain. I think scaling from a niche and actually targeting niches has become even more important over time. This is something we've been chasing from our beginning. That means like, having a core audience, having a small group of passionate fans that love the game you're delivering, and finding these people and building on that audience, I think is now one of the most important things, if not the most important thing. And I think this trend is going to continue and it's going to create new things. When we look back, a lot of the large companies that have now, been known and established themselves all come from an aspect of filling a certain niche. And they have grown to be massive companies. We might have forgotten that because so much time has passed, decades have gone by. But if you trace the story back, it all starts small. And this goes to show that in this new system of the industry that we're entering, these massive, large bets are not as safe anymore. And the market is looking for more innovation, more focus, more unique content. And I think it's important to position yourself like that from the start.
Yeah, absolutely. And I might just add another point too, because I know exactly what Atah's saying here. But in terms of innovation, it's like, don't make things that are like completely new that no one's ever seen them before. They don't exist in the market either. But it doesn't mean you can't take things that are familiar, but make them new and fresh and unique in that sense. Because I know sometimes we can confuse those terms or use them interchangeably, but then may not align. And again, I don't want to like speak for you, but I'm feeling that that's in line with what you were thinking or what you said.
Yeah, this definitely, it's like so. For example, for our case, we've taken the visual novel role playing game dialogue based approach. we have actually used an interface of a map-based visual and combined the two and added the strategy elements underneath. And then we added the thematics of a fictional 1950s universe, and we added all this gritty moral choices, politics, and everything on top. So the innovation is actually all these things coming together, but in a cohesive way. And you build that, as my experiences with iteration feedback over time with the right people. That's what I've experienced, but this is just a singular point of view. To get a lot of, do your research, go around, ask everyone. And if something works in some way for someone, that does not mean with another circumstance it will be the same. Doesn't mean if with different people it's going to be the same. So with the industry, that's another thing to keep in mind, that it's kind of like a chemical formula that changes with each variable each time. So it's really complex to find the right solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And random interesting fact, I mean, that is something like beer making process for any of you who are familiar. There's some really complex interesting things going there. So if you have any companies that can mass produce that stuff, it's kind of remarkable because there's so many interchangeables and variables and random type things that happen in that process. So but you're absolutely right, and thank you for clarifying too, and using that as a great example in terms of, hey, innovation and uniqueness are they're unique in what you put into the creation of them, not necessarily other elements, because there needs to be some control group there, right?
You need some reference points.
Exactly. Well, again, I can't thank you enough for here. But before we close, and for you, Atada, drop some either links or ways that people get in touch. We have a special offer, and hey, well, why don't you go ahead and share it with our listeners what that offer is?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, we are giving away some keys for our game Suzerain, and it's a DLC, and we're very excited for people to call in and grab those keys from Andrew himself. And we're very excited. We'd love to know what you think about our game and what the things we're trying to do, like all the cool stuff with different political subjects, moral subjects, asking the question of who you really are in these tough circumstances of leadership. I'm online available in different public profiles and spaces on LinkedIn, on Growth Mentor. Still continuing my activities with Factory Berlin. You can feel free to reach out anytime. And I'd love to talk more.
Awesome. So, hey, folks, as Atas said, we've got some keys. We're doing it where just reach out to Andrew at Rengen Marketing. I don't have a podcast exclusive email, so we are just going to do that. And, first come, first serve. And for those that you do, we'll go ahead and get you that key. So again, reach out, Andrew at rengenmarketing.com, put it IGM podcast as the subject line. And for those who get there first, we'll get some keys. And if not, then, hey, where else you can get the keys or do other things like Atas said. Check out thought-provoking.com. Lots of stuff there. And everywhere else that he mentioned, we'll make sure it's in the show notes so you can reach out, connect, or find out more. Atat, thank you so much again for being here today. This is such a great topic and one I'm glad we had an opportunity to discuss with you.
Pleasure being here, and there's a lot more to talk about. I'm actually heading off to another conference next week to talk a bit about how we survived the last 2 very complicated years in the games industry and all the methods we employed to make sure we're still operating, we're still growing, or creating new content. I think flexibility is key these years, and it's great that people like you are enabling the conversation online and spreading the knowledge. I can say multiple years back when I was thinking about founding this company and starting this journey, I felt like much more lonely and there was not as much information around. It was hard to get good information and have access to people. Nowadays, things are changing fast, and I think the environment is much better. Do my best to share all the knowledge we've acquired so maybe other people can chase their dreams and make their passions happen.
Absolutely love that. So, folks, if that wasn't more of an indicator than to connect in some way, shape, or form with Ata, then I don't know what is. But again, hey, Ata, appreciate you being here, doing those talks, doing more. And yeah, let's keep this going, folks, and spreading the love and the knowledge. So, thanks again for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.